We're going to keep going through section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, just where we've been. And again, section 6 is roughly from the healing of the blind men outside of Jericho all the way through to the end of the Olivet Discourse, so all the way through to chapter 25's ending. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders, because as Jesus is there in Jerusalem making these very stern statements and telling all these parables that he's telling, they are somewhat directed at the entire nation, but it's really the leaders of the nation that get most of his criticism, and they're very much blamed for all that is about to happen. And as of now, we are going through the fourth portion of that section, which is all of Matthew 23 and only Matthew 23. So that is very easy to remember where we are and what the fourth portion is. And I've titled this portion, The Errors of Moses Guide the People to Condemnation. So that is very much in line with the rest of this section, where you have certainly this coming judgment to be expected, but the blame for that falling upon the leaders of the nation. In this case, the scribes and the Pharisees in particular. That's the group that Jesus really talks about the most here in chapter 23. And this portion is composed of 3 warnings given by Jesus, all pertaining to the scribes and Pharisees. Each warning is directed to a slightly different group of people, but they're all about the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, my sermon today is going to continue our study of this first warning, and we've been there for a while and we have several messages left. There's a lot to cover here in this first warning. This is the warning he gives to the crowds and to his disciples, and we'll read that now here in verses 1 through 12 of chapter 23. It says, Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sat down in the chair of Moses. Therefore all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, and that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. I've already given you an overview of this warning and talked about the religion of me practiced by the scribes and the Pharisees. This is the way that all of their religious practices have become oriented around self-exaltation, so lifting themselves up in the eyes of other people. So I've given you an overview of that, and for the next several sermons, I want to discuss the details of this warning. And when I say detail, I mean detail. More detail than you likely ever wanted, although some of you who are more analytical and just can't leave these things alone will probably be very thankful for this particular sermon. But all of these sermons coming up are something to do with the details of what Jesus says. And today's sermon is very much detail-oriented, focusing specifically on these phylacteries and these tassels mentioned by Jesus as he is rebuking the scribes and the Pharisees. And that's there in verse 5. He says, They do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. And depending on how much knowledge you have of those things, that may or may not sound like very much of a rebuke. Now, for those of you who are young or old, really, who have no idea what Christ is talking about, this sermon is meant to answer all the questions you never knew you had. Right? We're going to talk about all of this with as much detail as I can possibly muster and figure out just what these phylacteries are and these tassels and what it means for them to be broadened and lengthened and what the problem with all that is. So this sermon could seem very tedious. Again, we're focusing on things that are very much sort of lying in the background of the text. These are things that people there listening to Jesus would have already known. They would not have needed an hour-long sermon to talk about all of it, but we do. We have to go through all of that and make sure we understand it. The thing is that I would have you remember is it is only through this kind of knowledge that we can apply the words of Jesus to ourselves. I want us to do exactly what the crowds there listening to Jesus should have been doing, applying these things to themselves. The problem is we can't do that until we get the knowledge they had of what these phylacteries and tassels are and what the problem with these things is. So we have to get their level of knowledge first, and then we can move on into application. So that is what we're doing in this sermon. And for those of you who share my enlightened joy of puns, today's sermon is called The Peril of Apparel. And if you write that out, it'll make more sense, The Peril of Apparel. And this sermon itself has two halves, and there is nothing complicated about the two halves of the sermon. One half goes to phylacteries, the other half goes to tassels. The one on phylacteries will be somewhat longer than for the tassels, but basically two halves for my outline today. So that is really all we're doing for the rest of this time here. Now, when Christians consider this teaching from Jesus, they usually start talking about the sin of externalism. And there is a word that you've probably heard before. If you have not heard that before, I'll go ahead and tell you what that means and what Christians generally mean by it. Externalism may be defined as the observance of visible aspects of religion without any concern for the invisible aspects of religion. You might say it is going through the motions or keeping up appearances without any real heart or soul to the matter. That is what externalism is as we talk about it in religion. However, I'm going to ask you not to think about externalism as we discuss these scribes and these Pharisees and their phylacteries and their tassels and anything else about these men. This doesn't simply apply to this sermon, this applies to all the future sermons that we have really in this entire portion. I'm going to ask you not to think about externalism, because the problem with the scribes and the Pharisees is not simply externalism, but self-exaltation. As I was talking about last time, their problem is that they've designed everything to exalt themselves. It's not merely that their deeds happen to be visible, but that their deeds are designed to be highly visible. They have designed their whole religious practices around this idea of showing off, basically, in a religious sense. So self-exaltation can be a form of externalism, but the specific form of externalism that we see here is fueled by pride. This is self-exaltation. These are people who think themselves better than others for whatever reason, and they're going to make sure everyone knows about it, and that's why they do the things they do. So it's not just externalism, it's self-exaltation. So remembering that as we move forward here, let's begin our study of phylacteries and tassels, and we'll see how this all ties together. So step one, as I said, is to talk about the phylacteries that Jesus mentions here. And if you pronounce that word differently, it doesn't matter because I'm the one speaking right now. Phylacteries is what we're saying. That's the rule for today. So the first question you probably have is, what is a phylactery? This is not something that you see when you go to shop for clothing or anything like that. You don't find the phylactery aisle or anything like that. What are these things here? Well, for those of you using the NASB, you actually have a very helpful marginal note. I don't know if the ESV does, but the NASB does. And I'm just going to read to you what the NASB says here. It describes these phylacteries as small cases containing scripture texts worn on the left arm and forehead for religious purposes. Right? So small cases containing scripture texts worn on the left arm and forehead for religious purposes. Now, to help you visualize that, I actually do have a handout for you all this morning, and if I can get a volunteer to hand these out for me, what I have 8, so one for each row here. So Adam, if you want to give, there's 4 there, and maybe run one over to Hong, and then, would you like to? Thank you very much. Just 1 to each row there, and just like pass it down the row so everyone can see. This is a modern practicing Jew, apparently a soldier of some kind. My guess is Israeli Defense Force, but I don't know that. And you see him wearing his phylacteries, and you see the big obnoxious circles that I drew on them, so you can see those things on there. And that'll help you visualize what we're talking about here when we talk about these phylacteries. By the way, The Jews do not refer to these boxes as phylacteries, but they call them tefillin, which is related to the Hebrew word for prayer. And you'll see why they have that connection to prayer in a moment here. So do not, if you ever speak to a modern day Jew about phylacteries, do not call them phylacteries. You will sound like a Gentile fool if you say it that way. They call them tefillin. They may not even know the word phylactery. This is probably a very Christian word for these things. Nonetheless, they do wear them, and you can see that in the picture that I handed out there. Our word for phylactery, by the way, comes from the Greek word, which sounds like phylactery. I mean, that's what Matthew writes here. We just bring it into English. So I don't know all the history with the words there, but that is the kind of thing we're talking about as you look at that handout. Now, you might wonder, how often or when do Jews wear these phylacteries that you see in this handout? Well, in modern times, the phylacteries are worn during the weekday morning prayer meetings held by the Jews. So these are prayer meetings. If you're a devout Jew, a practicing Jew, you have these prayer meetings that you attend every weekday morning, and that's when you wear these phylacteries. So they don't wear them all the time, and not even necessarily for every religious service they have, just during these prayer meetings. I don't know exactly if that goes all the way back to the time of Jesus. There could have been different times when these were worn. Nonetheless, I suspect it was very similar. So during times of prayer, which is why they call them tefillin, related to their word for prayer. So that's a phylactery. I've shown you that visually and given you a definition and all that. Now, your next question is probably, why do the Jews wear phylacteries? Why did they then and why do they now wear these phylacteries? Well, to understand why the Jews started wearing these phylacteries, we need to read and consider 4 passages of Scripture from the Law of Moses. I'm going to turn to all of these. You don't have to turn to them if you don't want to. I won't be staying at any of them for very long, but I do want to read them so you have some understanding of how this practice came about. So the first of these is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. This is one of the passages that will inform us to understand why they were wearing these things at all. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 9, this is Moses talking. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So the image given to us by Moses in this passage to describe devotion to the commandments of God is writing them on the hand and the forehead. So that is how Moses wants to portray this for you, being devoted to these commands, these things that he's saying that day. Like write them on your hand, write them on your head. Basically, that's the idea. Now, eventually, the Jews began doing that somewhat literally by writing scriptures on little scrolls and putting the scrolls in little boxes and strapping the boxes to their arms and their heads, just like you see in the handout there. So they don't get tattoos of these things because there's laws against that in the law of Moses, at least some kinds of tattoos, but they write them on scrolls and then bind them, rather literally, to parts of their body. We see a similar idea in the second passage I'm going to read. This is from later on in Deuteronomy. So this is chapter 11. This is a brief scripture. This is Deuteronomy 11, verse 18, where we see this. You shall therefore impress these words of mine on your heart and on your soul. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. Okay, so this command, very much the same as the earlier one. Frontals, by the way, that's just a word if you look it up in Hebrew. The totofoth, it just refers to some kind of headgear that is worn. So this is just their word for that, binding them on your hand, making them frontals on your forehead. This is, again, the imagery of being devoted to the commandments of God. The third scripture goes back to Exodus, and this is a somewhat longer one. This is Exodus chapter 13. This is what Moses says to Israel while they are preparing for the final plague on Egypt. This is the plague which will kill all the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. And right after that, that's when the Egyptians are going to say, get out of our country, we're done with you. Get out of here. So in preparation for that, Moses tells them a lot. And one of the things he tells them, sorry, we have a paperclip issue. Okay, one of the things he tells them in getting ready is here in Exodus 13, verses 1 through 10. It would help if I got to the right book of the Bible. Exodus 13, 1 through 10. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both of man and of beast. It belongs to me. Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you went out from Egypt, from the house of slavery, for by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out of this place. And nothing leavened shall be eaten. On this day in the month of Abib you are about to go forth. It shall be when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall observe this rite in this month. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten throughout the 7 days, and nothing leavened shall be seen among you, nor shall any leaven be seen among you in all your borders. You shall tell your son on that day, saying, It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall serve as a sign to you on your hand, and as a reminder on your forehead, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth, for with a powerful hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Therefore you shall keep this ordinance at its appointed time from year to year. Okay, so you see toward the end of that passage the same language about binding something to your hand and binding something to your forehead. We've seen that in the prior two scriptures that I've read. In this case, however, notice that the object to be worn is not the commandments of God, but rather the feast of unleavened bread during Passover. All this thing about not having any leaven in your homes or in the borders of Israel, not eating leavened bread during this time. And there are other reasons for that we could talk about from the book of Exodus. But right now, just realize the thing to be bound on their hand and on their head is the feast of unleavened bread, which I consider to be an important observation for realizing that this is figurative language and not literal language. All the stuff we've been reading about binding these things on your hand and your forehead, yeah, you might be able to write scriptures down on scrolls and bind those to your arm and to your forehead, but you can't do that with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That doesn't work. This is some kind of figure of speech. This idea of binding it to your hand and your forehead is not meant to be taken literally, and I think you see that here in this passage. Nonetheless, this is a passage that does get talked about with regard to these phylacteries, so it's very relevant to read it here. I do have one more. This is also in Exodus. The last of these scriptures from the law is also found in Exodus 13. You just have to go down a little further to verses 14 through 16. And here we see much the same kind of thing. It says, And it shall be when your son asks you in the time to come, saying, What is this? Then you shall say to him, With a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, from the house of slavery. It came about when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord the males, the first offspring of every womb, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem. So it shall serve as a sign on your hand and as phylacteries on your forehead, for with a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. Okay, now I have two noteworthy points about that scripture to make. The first is, once again, we're dealing with an object that cannot be literally worn on the hand or on the forehead. Just like last time it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread they were supposed to bind to their arms and to their heads. In this case, it is sacrificing the firstborn animals and redeeming the firstborn sons. This practice, of course, commemorates the fact that in Egypt, God killed all the firstborn except in the land of Israel, which means God now has a claim on those firstborn. So that's why you treat them the way you do, and you're supposed to bind that to your arm and to your head. And that's the figure of speech given by Moses for what they're supposed to do. And again, I think it has to be a figure of speech because you cannot bind this practice to your arms and to your heads. So there's one observation. The second point to make is only for those of you that are using the NASB or heard me read it just now because I'm using the NASB, and that is the word phylactery being used by the NASB translation in this passage. You may have noticed that it actually uses the word phylacteries. Well, so those of you with the ESV will not see the word phylactery. You're just going to see the more generic word frontlet or frontal, like we were talking about earlier. That's what you're going to see there. And the ESV is actually more accurate at this point in that the word used there is the same word we've been seeing through all these passages I've been reading, just the word for frontal, totophoth. It just means stuff you wear on your head. It doesn't specifically mean phylactery in the sense that we're talking about, in the sense of this handout I gave you with the guy wearing the phylacteries. It doesn't necessarily refer to that in particular. I just want to prevent you from getting the idea that they had phylacteries all the way back in the time of Moses, because we don't know that for sure. We don't have any strong evidence of that at all. So I just want to, in a sense, make that note on the way the NASB translates it. So those are the four passages, though. Those are the four passages which I think give you the reason that the Jews started wearing these phylacteries. They wore them due to an overly literal and somewhat mistaken application of these four passages. They see all this talk about binding stuff to your arm and to your forehead, and they take it literally, and they come up with these phylacteries as a way to do that. So that's why, ultimately why they wear these. Now, what I said earlier about the NASB translation in this last passage and not knowing when this all started, you might be asking yourself the question, when did they start? Do we have any kind of point of beginning for any of this? Well, the truth is we don't know for sure when they started wearing these phylacteries, but we can set some kind of date in a sense. Archaeologists have discovered two phylacteries, much like the ones you see in those handouts there that I was giving out to you. These were found at the community at Qumran. Qumran was that community built by the Essene monks, basically. They were Jewish monks of some sort. There at the Dead Sea, this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were also found. One of the other things they found as they were excavating that community was some phylacteries that were remarkably intact. So we know at least back that far. So the community at Qumran was founded within a century or so before the time of Jesus. So at least, before that time, somewhere in that phase of history, that's when the Jews started wearing these phylacteries. And then also another note that I'll make on that, in those phylacteries that they found at Qumran, there were 4 passages of Scripture written on little scrolls in those phylacteries. Would anyone like to guess what passages of Scripture were in those phylacteries? The passages I've been reading to you, yes. And to this day, those are the passages that the Jews have inside their phylacteries. So if you're wondering what scriptures they have written down inside of their phylacteries, it's those 4 that I read to you. And that goes all the way back to Qumran, and it's what they do to this day. So again, we don't know exactly when they started doing all of that, but within a century or so before the time of Jesus, they were doing this. So the next thing we know about the history of these phylacteries moving forward from Qumran, the next thing we know for sure is what Jesus says in our passage for today here in Matthew 23. And again, what he says about these phylacteries, he says with regard to the scribes and the Pharisees, they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and they lengthen the tassels of their garments. So here thinking specifically of the phylacteries at this point. Apparently, the scribes and the Pharisees had a habit of trying to outdo other worshipers by wearing especially broad phylacteries. So they make them bigger, they make them wider. That is apparently what they were doing in the time of Jesus. Perhaps if you have another look at the handout that I gave you, and if you imagine that particular man there wearing phylacteries twice as big as that, that probably gets you a good idea of what the Pharisees and the scribes were doing in the time of Jesus. They take the size of an average phylactery and just make it bigger. I want a big phylactery on my forehead and on my arm. So that's what they were doing there in the time of Jesus. And that is the source of Jesus' rebuke, them wearing these broad phylacteries. Now, the only other thing we know about these phylacteries from ancient Judaism is that they were still problematic even after the days of Jesus. so problematic that other rabbis were actually trying to clamp down on the problems that they saw in their own time. And this is something that is another reason for me to bring up my copy of the Mishnah. This is the written form of the Jewish oral traditions that were circulating from before the time of Jesus until after the time of Jesus, and they finally wrote them down in about the year 200. This is something I would like to read to you from this on this topic of phylacteries. As a continuing problem among the Jews, this would reflect later rabbinic judgments, but here we go. This is what he says here. This is Megaloth 4:8. I know you can't turn there, but I just want to quote it for the record. I'm being videoed, right? If people are following along, I want them to know that I know my source citations here. Okay, anyway, here's what some later rabbis put together on phylacteries. If a man made his phylacteries round, it is a danger and no fulfilling of the commandment. If he put them on his forehead or on the palm of his hand, this is the way of heresy. If he overlaid them with gold or put them over his sleeve, this is the way of the sectaries or factionalists, or however you want to translate that. So that is just a little brief nugget there that we have from the Mishnah about these phylacteries and some of the problems that were being seen later. Now, much of that is easy to understand. Some people were using gold on their phylacteries. As you can see from the handout I gave you, his phylacteries are not made of gold. They're probably just wood and leather. That's all they are. But some people are like, I want to put gold on my phylactery. So they were doing that, and some rabbis were saying, no, don't put gold on your phylactery. Now, the next one, maybe noticeable locations like being worn over the sleeve or on the palm. You might notice that the guy in the handout, he's wearing his arm phylactery kind of down low like this. Some people apparently started wearing them on the palm, which perhaps was more visible. Some are wearing them over the sleeve, so maybe higher up to where it's not covered by their sleeve hanging down or anything like that. Seems to be a problem with, again, kind of showing off your phylactery somehow. Look at my phylactery. Here it is. I don't know exactly what the problem would be with a round phylactery, but I can say this. We know that most phylacteries are cube-shaped, and you can see that in the handout I gave you. They're boxes, they're cubes. So wearing a round phylactery would be wearing a different style, right? You would look different, and you would in that way draw attention to yourself. And what you see then later on here after the time of Jesus, there's still this problem with people using phylacteries to draw attention to themselves. The scribes and the Pharisees made big phylacteries. People later on were making gold phylacteries and wearing them in more noticeable locations and wearing different styles of phylacteries to draw attention to themselves. Seems like the same kind of thing happening a little later on, and later rabbis were trying to say, okay, you got to cut this out. Like, stop wearing these bizarre different phylacteries. Just wear the standard phylactery and wear them in the standard places. And that seems to be the judgment they were making at that time. And that, although that is maybe not a very good place to end, it is pretty much all we know about phylacteries from the ancient Jews. Which means we can move on to the second half of this sermon and talk about something else. We can talk about the tassels or the fringes mentioned by Jesus alongside these phylacteries. Now, this explanation will not be nearly as long as the one for phylacteries because I think we all know what a tassel is, but we still need some explanation for why they're wearing these tassels. So to explain these tassels, we need to go to Numbers chapter 15 and read a passage that's there about these tassels. Let's see here. Numbers 15, I'm going to read verses 37 through 41. We'll wait until we're settled here. Numbers 15, verses 37 through 41, talking about these tassels being worn by the scribes and the Pharisees and trying to get an understanding of why Jesus rebukes them for lengthening their tassels and all of that. So Numbers 15, verses 37 through 41, we see this. The Lord also spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, and tell them that they shall make for themselves tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations. and that they shall put on the tassel of each corner a cord of blue. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and to remember all the commandments of the Lord, so as to do them and not follow after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you played the harlot, so that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so this tassel with its blue cord was meant to be a reminder to the Hebrews that they needed to obey the commandments of God. As they're walking around, as they look at each other and they see these tassels hanging down off of their garments, it's supposed to be a visible reminder of the commandments of God and the need to be holy. As a point of reference, you might compare this commandment to the trend that existed many years ago. It may still be a trend today, I don't know. I'm not very fashionable, whether in Christian fashion or any other kind of fashion. But there was very much the trend back when I was growing up of wearing apparel with WWJD on it. What would Jesus do? And you wear those kinds of things, bracelets or shirts or whatever, to remind you to do what Jesus would do in any given situation, to remind you throughout the day that your life is not your own, you're supposed to be following Jesus. These tassels worn by the Hebrews were meant for a similar purpose. In this case, there's an actual command of God in the law about wearing these tassels for that purpose. Now, after the Old Testament, the next clear reference we have to these tassels is once again in the words of Jesus himself here in Matthew 23, verse 5, where he's rebuking the scribes and the Pharisees for what they do. And again, the rebuke here is that they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. So by the time of Jesus, certain Jews, like the scribes and the Pharisees, were wearing longer versions of these tassels in order to draw attention to themselves. Remember, they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. So the length of these tassels is ultimately about drawing attention to themselves. And Christ rebukes the scribes and the Pharisees for that practice of wearing these longer tassels for the purposes of exalting themselves in the eyes of the people. Now, I can make one other note about these tassels from the ministry of Christ, and that is we might have some evidence that Jesus himself wore these tassels. And that would be expected. After all, Jesus was a Jew living in the land of the Jews. Probably would have caused an upset for him not to wear these tassels, although Jesus has no problem causing an upset if the situation calls for it. Nonetheless, we would expect him to be wearing these tassels, and we have some references from the ministry of Jesus in which he might be wearing them. I just want to show these to you so you know about them. In these two events from the ministry of Jesus, two events, we see references made to the fringe of the cloak of Jesus. And that's usually how it's translated, the fringe of his garment. The first of these events is the healing of the woman who had the flow of blood that no doctor could cure, and that was just getting worse and worse. In Matthew, the description of this is found in Matthew chapter 9. This is verses 20 through 22. So going back to the early ministry of Jesus, it says, "A woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, 'If I only touch his garment, I will get well.' But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, 'Daughter, take courage, your faith has made you well.' And at once the woman was made well." So there's the first event where we see a reference to the fringe of the cloak of Jesus. And in this case, the woman went to touch the fringe of his cloak and was healed. And we see in other references to other Gospels the same event. She was definitely healed when she touched the fringe on the cloak of his, the fringe of his cloak. Excuse me, I can't. Too many clothing terms being thrown around here. I can't keep them straight. But anyway, there's one event. There's another event very similar to this. In Matthew 14, verse 36, this happened when Jesus was at Gennesaret. This is Matthew 14, verses 34 through 36. It says, "When they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word into all that surrounding district and brought to him all who were sick. And they implored him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak. and as many as touched it were cured. So here we have another healing story, and once again, people being healed by touching the fringe on the cloak of Jesus. Now the word which we translate as fringe is krospedon. This is a Greek word that is actually the same word used by the Jews when they translated the Old Testament into Greek in the Septuagint translation, back there in Numbers 15 on that commandment about wearing these tassels. So when they got to Numbers 15 doing their translation from Hebrew to Greek, the word they used for those tassels was krospedon, the same word used here in the ministry of Jesus for these healing miracles, where people are touching his fringe on his cloak there and being healed. Therefore, it's possible that we should be thinking about these blue tassels whenever we read these references to the fringe of Jesus. That could be what's going on here when the lady touches his fringe and is healed, and when these other people do as well. However, having said all that, we must also admit that the Greek word krospedon can refer simply to the hem of any ordinary garment. It can, whatever this thing is here, holding your shirt together or whatever that keeps it from unraveling the hem, it can just refer to that. Krospedon is broad enough to refer to that kind of thing. So while it does refer to the tassels worn by the Jews, it does not refer only to those things. And you have to narrow it down by context if you have enough context to make that decision. Which means in reality, none of this is actually conclusive. It may be that these people were being healed by touching the tassel of Jesus' garment. It may just be they were touching the hem of his garment. We don't actually know for sure. The only reason I wanted to mention this is because this is very often brought up when talking about the tassels there that Jesus mentions with the scribes and the Pharisees, or in these healing miracles. It's very often talked about, so I just want you to know that's kind of a we don't know sort of situation. It might be those tassels, it might not be. I just wanted you to know that. Now, the only other relevant information about these tassels that I have for you today is how the length of these tassels came to be standardized. And I'm sure it's a, if we were not talking about a passage in Scripture, you probably wouldn't care. But I do think this is important. There was a time later on when the rabbis actually did standardize how long these tassels were supposed to be. Now, this standardization seems to have happened as a result of a long-standing debate between two primary schools of rabbis in Israel. So if you want to know the kind of stuff that the rabbis were debating with each other back in that day, how long should the tassel be? That's one of the, it seems important enough to them to argue about that, how long your tassels ought to be. Now, the two schools that I'm talking about here are the schools of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And I've mentioned those names before and those schools before. These are, if you're a rabbi in ancient Israel, you probably belong to one of those two groups. And those two groups are named after two rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, who were in the generation just prior to Jesus and were the most popular rabbis of their time. So they developed a lot of followers, two schools built up around them. And again, if you're there in Israel in the time of Jesus or afterward, you belong to one school or the other if you're a rabbi. Now, I don't know whether the debate over tassel length started with those two rabbis, or whether the debate was older than them, or whether the debate was started by their disciples. I don't know any of that, but I do know those two schools had a debate with one another on the length of tassels. And after some time passed, this would be after the time of Jesus, the school of Shammai prevailed, and the length of these tassels was standardized to 4 fingers long. So think about your index finger there, 4 of those, so about 1 foot, 12 inches as we would call it. That is the standard length of these tassels as it was standardized later on. So there was this time whenever you might see different Jews wearing different lengths of tassels for whatever reason, and eventually everyone said later on, you know what, let's just make it all standard, 4 fingers long. There you go. There's the length of your tassel. And you now know everything that I know about these tassels, at least that is relevant to what we're talking about here in Matthew 23. So to bring this somewhat to a close, today the goal was simply to talk about the scribes and the Pharisees and this peril of apparel that we're talking about here with these phylacteries and these tassels and the problems that Jesus saw in what they were doing with these two articles of clothing. The true peril of these men is that they use these highly visible forms of righteousness for the purpose of self-exaltation. They're going to make their phylacteries broad, they're going to make their tassels long, and in so doing, they're going to make themselves look really holy and get some notoriety in the eyes of the people. And Jesus rebukes them for these things. The phylacteries, of course, was a standard practice, wearing these cases with these scripture texts during prayer time. The fault that Jesus finds with the scribes and the Pharisees is making them bigger, doing something to make themselves look different. As for the tassels, those were commanded by God in the law of Moses. If you were a Jew, you were supposed to wear those. But the scribes and the Pharisees look around and they say, I'm going to make my tassel longer than everyone else's. And that's the kind of thing they were doing, again, to draw attention to themselves. And so, while both the phylactery and the tassel were meant in some way to point people to God, the scribes and the Pharisees instead used this apparel to draw attention to themselves. So rather than being part of your worship and part of your desire for holiness, now it's all about this religion of me that the scribes and the Pharisees had going on, trying to make themselves look really great in the eyes of the people. So it totally turns religion on its head. This is supposed to be a Godward thing, but instead they make it all about themselves. And that is why Jesus rebukes them. Now, as a final note, I want to remind you of stuff that I've said already in this sermon, and that is that later rabbinic decisions basically approved of the criticisms being made by Jesus. They actually can't come along later, and whether they named Jesus' name or not, they probably wouldn't, but they basically said, yeah, he was right about all of that. With regard to the phylacteries, the later rabbis did teach that people should not use phylacteries to draw attention to themselves. Don't put gold on them. Don't use a different style of phylactery. Don't wear them in different locations than what is standard. Just do what everyone else is doing. Don't draw attention to yourself in those ways. As for the tassels, the later rabbis decided on a standard length for those tassels so that no man could make himself look more holy by wearing longer tassels, which is what the scribes and the Pharisees had been doing in the times of Jesus. Now, I want to mention that to you because in modern scholarship, it is very fashionable to accuse Jesus of being heavy-handed with the scribes and the Pharisees here in Matthew 23. Say, oh, those men could not have possibly been as bad as Jesus is making them out to be. Surely these things are not really problems. Well, later developments in Judaism, at least on this point, actually vindicate Jesus. When he goes out there and starts criticizing these men for making their broad phylacteries and their long tassels, it may have seemed extreme at the time, but later rabbis basically said he was right about that, to the point where they were going to issue rulings of their own to kind of bring these things into standard so that these things won't be problems anymore. So in this case, Jesus was vindicated later on by his own people. Even if they didn't name his name in those decisions, surely they saw the error of their ways to some degree. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time talking about just the phylacteries and the tassels themselves. Didn't really have any application for you all yet. All of this, however, is meant to be preparation for my next sermon. Next time, I'm going to locate these phylacteries and tassels within the larger topic of self-exaltation as practiced by the scribes and the Pharisees. And in that sermon, I will get more into our own need to avoid self-exaltation through appearances, which is basically the problem with the scribes and the Pharisees. They're trying to go based on appearances, make themselves appear more holy, and all of that is the wrong way to think about it, and that's what we're talking about next time. So next time you might say, I'm going to ask the question, what are our phylacteries? What are our tassels? And what ways do we make this same mistake in a different way? But I can't get to any of that without this information here, because this is what Jesus was talking about. So you had to know all of this stuff about phylacteries and tassels first. So we got it all out of the way. Next time will be far more geared toward how this applies to us. Okay, if you have any questions about phylacteries and tassels, I will try to answer them. I've told you most of what I know, but if there are questions, we can talk about them or comments of some other kind.